I am a huge advocate for conscious consumerism, but I don't want the individual to feel like their only stakes in this issue is buying power.
Right.
I think it's about community building. It's about understanding the issues in your locality, which I realized there was a very specific local context that I could operate in and help make some change.
Today we're going to be speaking to Aditi Mayer, who is a thought leader in the sustainable fashion space, a labor rights activist, and an amazing storyteller. Aditi, thank you so much for coming all the way from LA for this podcast. I'm pretending that you did it just for us.
You know what? Let's just pretend that I did. I'm so glad to see you. It's been, I think, a year since I saw you last.
Absolutely, nearly a year. So we're here today to talk about empowering workers, which is something that you specialize in. And when I first started following you, one of the things that you really opened my eyes to, and this was before I really understood the sustainability aspect of fashion, was how there seems to be a divide between the East and West and how much we can learn from other cultures. So I guess my question for you is this idea of disposability that I think a lot of people now understand fashion to have. How does this actually impact how we interact with clothes and whoever made them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always say that the project of fast fashion has been one about alienation and disposability. And so we're talking about our relationship to our literal garments, where people find them to be disposable, you know, wearing them for a few times and then discarding them, to literally how workers are treated in our current overarching system. And so addressing disposability culture, I think, is a guiding North Star value that kind of informs my work. And I think the antidote to that is a culture of care, whether it's how we are treating our clothes, but also our environment and our workers. And so that has kind of been the guiding light that informs my work in this space from a perspective of human rights and environmental justice.
These are pretty deep topics. And I don't think that a lot of people first associate environmentalism with quite political, quite heavy, broader notions of colonization or even racism. And how did you connect the dots?
That's a great question. So I had my start in this space 11 years ago now, when the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened in 2013. And at that point, I was in my first year of uni. I was studying journalism and international studies. And I remember hearing about this factory collapse, like so many people in the fashion industry and beyond. I was so taken aback of how the fixation on output, scale, and speed created the conditions for workers' lives to be disregarded and eventually lost with this collapse. And then I realized that where I'm from in downtown LA actually has a huge garment industry. It's the second biggest industry in LA. And so at that point, I got involved with telling stories from the workers' perspective around labor abuses, but also the resistance that workers were kind of partaking in, doing campaigns against major, labor violators in LA. And so I think between my academic background of learning about larger economic systems and histories of colonization, and then the more, intimate work of telling these stories and getting a beautiful insight on what grassroots organizing can look like, that was a huge part of my internal politic that was being formed at that time. And then the internet. The internet was a space for me to share and, engage in that work of creativity. I think all of that came together to kind of set my position in the space as a storyteller championing those values.
And I think that the way that you do it as well is quite cinematic. It's actually very appealing to look at. And I think that the way you speak about it as well is so elegant, but also so empathetic, that it's actually very easy to consume, even if it's something that you weren't seeking. And I think that's a really powerful tool that you have. One thing I'm really interested in is, how did you get access to where most people aren't allowed to go, where most cameras aren't allowed to, enter?
Yeah, so there is an amazing organization in downtown LA called the Garment Workers Center. They were created in the 90s, and they are a worker-led organization. And so this organization is doing amazing work with educating workers about their rights and also organizing campaigns against specific players that have been major labor violators. And so through accessing that network, I was approaching it as a journalist. Let's tell these stories. And I think that sort of attention on frontline communities that are directly being impacted was a really important element of it. And I think in terms of my work online, having this balance of outfit of the days and like sustainable fashion and personal style balanced with larger systemic issues, and also how we could engage in this work beyond just buying power. I am a huge advocate for conscious consumerism, but I don't want the individual to feel like their only stakes in this issue is buying power.
Right.
I think it's about community building. It's about understanding the issues in your locality, which I realized even though Rana Plaza happened in this distant place that was Bangladesh, there was a very specific local context that I could operate in and help make some change. And so I think that's always what I'm trying to balance is these are big meta issues, but there are very tangible, tactile ways that we can enact change.
I really love that because I think that's so empowering. I mean, I think when you have an issue as large as the one we're talking about now, which impacts not just workers in the supply chain, whoever makes our clothes, but even us as shoppers, as individuals, we do need this multi-pronged approach. And I love that the way that you do it is so on the ground, like you practice what you preach, which is really cool. I also know that you don't just speak to garment workers in LA, you also go abroad.
Yeah, so I would say LA has obviously been a very fundamental part of my work as someone who was born and raised there, but I come from a South Asian background. My family is from India, from Punjab specifically, which is an agricultural hub in India. And I come from a lineage of farmers and artisans. And so in 2022, I spent 1 year in India looking at fashion through the lens of farmers and artisans. And so the goal there was to understand fashion as a product of agriculture, which sounds quite basic, but I also think it's something that we forget.
Yes, definitely.
We have a retail landscape that is upwards of 60% of synthetic fibers. And I think there's so much potential with regenerative agriculture within the fashion landscape. And so whereas the beginning half of my career was about naming the ills of fast fashion, I would say now I'm a bit more interested in the work of solutions-oriented storytelling. And I believe that between agriculture and supporting artisan and craft communities, we have a solution that kind of decentralizes fashion and presents us with so many ways of creation and supporting communities that have had inherently symbiotic relationships with land and creation.
I think what's so important as well is as the world develops, as more problems become uncovered, you also have to develop like your direction.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily pivoting, but it's kind of like the next layer to it, you know? And personally for me as well, I think that I've found that my focus has had to develop too, because I started off talking about quality clothing and planned obsolescence. And, you know, this was like my hyper focus.
Yeah.
And then it kind of developed this year into thinking about, can luxury lead the way in changing these things, right? Because if they're supposed to be upholding a certain quality, could they be responsible for like bringing back what has been lost? So speaking to designers, it's been so eye-opening what the issues are. And I found that kind of influencing the way that I talk about fashion now. And it's like, you don't know what you don't know until you do.
100%. And I think it's this process for me of like deepening my practice from those that are at the front lines, but also designers and brands that actually have to put these things into effect. I know what I mean. We just don't want to speak very broadly about the issues without really contextualizing what change looks like and takes from like an industry level.
When you speak to garment workers or artisans, even farmers, what is it that they want people to know?
Yeah, I mean, it's so many different things depending on who we're talking to, right? I think in LA, when it came to speaking to garment workers who were doing this amazing work of, again, campaigns against major labor violators, a lot of them were saying we need to address the sheer speed and scale of the industry. And so that naturally leads into conversations around policy and degrowth, right? And actually, the Garment Workers Center in LA ended up engaging in what I think is one of the most important pieces of policy that I've seen during my time in fashion, which was the the Garment Worker Protection Act. And so in LA, before the Garment Worker Protection Act, most garment workers were being paid a piece rate, which means that they were being paid per piece they made as opposed to the hour. And that piece rate was often as low as 2 to 3 cents. And we're talking about a city like LA. So it was common to see workers making as little as $5 an hour.
And when you say piece, you literally mean like a shirt or like...
Per piece, yeah.
Wow.
So with the Garment Worker Protection Act, it did a few critical things, but it eliminated the piece rate as like a price floor. So the minimum wage was kind of enacted. And it also created a direct line of accountability between brands, retailers, and factories, because we had a lot of instances of wage theft where the brand would blame the factory would blame the brand under all these layers of subcontracting. So that was addressed. And so I think when I think about my personal theory of change, it's building more awareness in consumer bases, building workers' rights, but also large corporate shifts and policy shifts, which ties into governments. I think this trifecta is really balancing like building power from the bottom up, but also addressing accountability that needs to be taken at the top.
Absolutely. I think fashion has a problem with willful ignorance.
For sure.
You know, you don't ask, you don't need to know. So hearing about that is actually very encouraging. I think that this happens in London too. When I've been to design studios or factories in London that are doing their best to kind of be responsible, they'll often tell me about, unfortunately, you know, there's a retailer who I will not be naming, don't worry, everyone calm down. There's a retailer in, you know, the UK, and you wouldn't think that they participate in this really murky supply chain. However, they probably know or don't know, but whoever they're hiring, their main factory is actually outsourcing to third parties within the UK, no, within London. So when you were saying that garment workers in LA were earning $3, oh my God, what is it?
3 cents.
Sorry.
What do you call it here? Pence?
Pence, yeah.
Pence, okay.
What a weird word. So, you know.
Or you know.
So at first I was like, no, that's horrible. And then I was like, wait, because you forget, like you say, fashion has this facade that makes you forget that there's so much underneath.
Completely. Yeah. So it's unpacking those layers and then thinking about what the stakes are for the everyday consumer to think about how they can be involved. Yeah.
And do you think that it's as simple as boycotting brands? Do you think it's as simple as buying less? And if it is, I'm pretty sure people do care. And I do think that, you know, they have this sensitivity to them. So what is it that's still alienating everyone?
I do think there is still growth that can occur in terms of like consumer awareness. We exist in a space where there is obviously a lot more fluency around consuming less, buying secondhand, supporting brands doing the work. But I don't think that has reached the mass consciousness now. So I think there's still work to be done there. I also think, yeah, obviously I will always champion conscious consumerism, but we also have to contend with issues of scale, like I mentioned, and creating more circular systems that can actually address the issue of waste and creating less raw materials from a virgin level. And I think there's also more deeper esoteric conversations we can have about personal style and the trend cycle, making people feel like they need to constantly consume. So even though we are both, I suppose, content creators in the space, among other things, and are often seen as like inspirations on a style level, I never want my role in this industry to be, oh, imbibe my style.
Right.
You could get inspiration from it, but there is no uniform aesthetic that I want to associate with sustainability.
Yes, 100%. And sometimes when people don't think of me as someone who works in the sustainable fashion space, I'm always like, yeah, cool. Because I don't even know what that's supposed to look like.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And also I think, especially in the UK, there is this idea that there is a look that you have, that you are middle class, that you are white, that you are thin. And even for me, being here talking to you, I'm even shocked that I'm doing that instead of the person I just described, you know? So I definitely think that there is, you know, a balance to be struck as well when you're obviously passionate passionate about fashion and personal style, but you also want to bring in the bigger story, which is don't consume as much, be mindful about this. But also, if that's not enough for you, great. These are also some charitable organizations you can get involved in. And I just think that people who are perhaps a little bit intimidated by activism and that word, there are just so many more revolutionary things that you can do, like mending. Love that. Learning to sew. Love this. But, you know, as I'm talking about this, I've realized that I'm very much speaking through a lens of I'm imagining a female. I'm talking about like very feminine things. I don't know if that's correct or not, but one thing I wanted to ask you is so many garment workers are female.
Right.
And, you know, both of us being women talking about this, what is that kind of, what's your personal experience like knowing that someone that looks like me or you is out there feeling like they're invisible?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that like fashion as it currently stands, like the broken fashion industry, right? Which is largely the dominant fast fashion model, is exasperating so many existing issues that we have in our world today. So we know it's upwards of 80% of garment workers that are women. But when I was looking at this issue from the context of downtown LA, it's women and also undocumented immigrants. So understanding the layers in which vulnerable communities are kind of preyed upon, I think is a really important element of it. Because I always say, as someone who I suppose is an activist in the sustainable fashion space, sustainability for me has been an unlearning of exploitation through the lens of power dynamics. So when, you know, if we kind of circle this back to your first question about a culture of care, this work becomes inherently tied to social justice issues and environmental justice issues because you have to understand the context and landscape that you're operating from. So rather than existing in a vacuum and telling everyone, buy here, buy that, my knee-jerk reaction isn't going to be buy anything. It's understand the issues, understand how you can support the communities, whether that is through buying power or, you know, organizing alongside these communities or just educating yourselves on the issues that exist. And so, yeah, I think the dimension of like women disproportionately occupying the space is really important to note because I also think women in the fields of business are also already resisting so many problematic like power structures, toxic work cultures. And so if we can actually harness this idea of like gender equality to empower us to like address these broken systems, it's so much more powerful because we have this conversation around representation, right? Like we want to see more people in the room, but we don't want to recreate those same power dynamics. So we could actually think about the ways that our identities as women of color can actually allow us to say, there's something broken about the system. There's a lot of power in that.
Yeah, definitely. I think whatever ways that we can relate to something will incite, I think, a more authentic response and also one that's sustained. Because I think we can see something that's emotional and we can see something that's, you know, like a tearjerker or like, oh my God, I didn't realize that. And we can just as easily forget about it. But it's perhaps that kind of human connection or whatever it is that really appeals to you that I think is so important.
Yeah. I think it's having as many touch points for sustainability. Because again, we are kind of approaching the fashion as a Trojan horse to talk about these larger questions approach. But when I'm thinking about my background in like labor justice, it's also about immigrant rights. It's about gender equality. So like if someone is more invested in those keywords, can that be the unlock for them to realize that sustainability is actually deeply, deeply embedded with every critical fight of our generation?
Yes, I love that. I absolutely love that. I personally have this like, where I hate it when people see sustainability as this like weird little corner of the world.
Yeah.
We have to look a certain way or, you know, be a certain way to participate. And I love that you've just highlighted it is in every single thing that we do. And it's so true. I mean, every product we touch has a supply chain. You know, humans create things, whether it's fashion or not. So I think that's such an important takeaway. And again, something that weirdly we forget. I do want to ask you a closing question.
Yes.
being as influential as yourself, I think a lot of people want to see into your mind in a non-weird way. So is there kind of like a book, a podcast, even a brand, or like someone we should follow that you really want to spotlight?
Yeah. So I feel like we've been talking a lot about power and how power is centralized, and we want to kind of like give power a more equal footing in fashion. And so I think I want to tie this in with my work in India. So India is full of so many local ecologies that are tied to specific fibers and maybe specific techniques around natural dyeing, embroidery, whatever it may be. And I think that was such an inspiring time for me to realize that the ideal future of fashion for me is decentralized and localized, because then it allows us to tap into all of these knowledge sets that we have that are inherently more sustainable. And so when we think about how fashion is broken today, it's because power is so centralized. And so a great book that kind of talks about this idea is Rebecca Burgess' Fiber Sheds. Because when we think about the fiber shed model, it's about this idea of place-based textile sovereignty. So can we have in a 150-mile radius makers, growers, spinners, all contributing to this local ecosystem? And so I think that's a really powerful idea, but it's also not a new idea. My time in India just confirmed to me how there's so much ancestral wisdom in places around the world. And my hope now as a storyteller in this space is to kind of champion these cultures of stories, of climate and craft, all of which are deeply embedded. But I think culture becomes this umbrella for us to realize how wisdom from plants to creation to how we honor the things and adorn ourselves are all deeply connected. So that is my roundabout way of saying one of your guests on this podcast has an amazing book that you should read.
I love that. I love that we're all just supporting each other, hugging each other up. Thank you so much for being here. It was amazing to speak to you, and you just speak so eloquently. I love it.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad I could be here. It's a great time in London.
Wow, after a conversation like that, where do I even start? Aditi describes herself as a problem solver, but it's her ability to tell stories that highlights the voices of those farmers and artisans in India to the LA garment workers that really reminds me that if we want to reconnect with those who make our clothes, maybe we should just start listening.